Lie back, put your headphones in, snuggle in tight. Are you all ready? Then let me read you a bedtime story, my dears. Let's begin. The Cost of Knowledge by the Nightinator. An incessant baying of nightmarish quality emanates uncontrollably from my tremendous hound, which alone somehow keeps those abnormal monstrosities at bay. The walls of my complex rattle with the severe frequency of the barks, and echoes back an augmented demonic cacophony. Perplexing as it seemed, no being of the living realm should have been capable of confronting those hideous shadows of unknown and unmentionable spectral dimensions. For how much longer my mighty hound might stall those abhorrent creatures, I know not, and shall waste time no further in describing my piteous life, as my end seems hauntingly near. The lights will soon go off, over the horizon past rows of curling waves, where merry people rejoice, and aquatic life prevails. I can spot the vestiges of dark clouds accumulating, blocking the last rays of sun, sealing my fate in this grotto. Life may be long for my readers, but time is relative, and time is dissipating fast. Time is fading, and I must begin. I must hurry, for the first signs of dreary weakness in my colossal hound is palpable. As in general, whenever the obnoxious extremities of weather confront me, an unmistakable, ghastly reminiscence of my dear, dead friend Robert, and a shadow of infinite and inexplicable origin would hideously manifest in my conscience and physical world. An indescribable, insane, was Robert as deemed by the greatest connoisseurs of his field, for even the researchers and scientific enthusiasts of the greatest stature claimed that the plans which Robert had in his unstable brain, the machines in the laboratory which Robert devised, were infinitely of the most insane form, and certainly not for the feeble ones. Certainly not meant to be speculated by the general population, as for such it was never meant for me to ponder, or merely even scrutinize that grotesque workplace. The enthusiasms through which he had conveyed his horrible experiments on that desolate December night insidiously wore out as time went on. Those horribly wrong conjectures gradually ate his sanity, and all that was left of him was just a grotesque reminder of a poor destitute. The shadow which I saw on that horrible night still returns to me whenever the soft pitter-patter sound of cold, stolid raindrops grace my aching eardrums. Robert, by the virtue of that abhorrent shadow, or by his savage deeds, became something entirely unidentifiable, an unnameable entity that night. Authorities and investigators alike sealed shut the curious case too soon. The unrecognizable corpse of my dead friend lay there gazing into oblivion, still asking peculiar questions, still demanding inexplicable answers. During the last days of his daunting ennui, he started behaving irrationally, sleeping at odd hours. His frequent visits to my edifice got fewer and fewer. Often he would be found by his bedstand, gaze fixated at his queer machinery, staring sinisterly as if following a peculiar oddity into vast obscurity through his hollowed-out, sleep-deprived eyes. He would often talk feverishly and would complain about queer voices keeping him up in the nocturnal hours. but nothing can be compared to the state of his sanity on his penultimate day, the day I forever parted my way with thunderstorms, the day which made me repel the season of rain forever, the day which instilled fear in me so morbid that I raced out of the cabin barefoot into the vast, interminable canopy of sinister darkness, amidst several shadows of abnormal quality hunting me to extinction. That hideous night, I saw the decaying remains of my friend the last time, as equally stunned investigators have profusely refused to open any detail or even display the carcass as if fearing some horrid entity on their own. And defying ordeal has left a gargantuan impact on my own physical and mental well-being, and has wreaked untold havoc on my degenerating sanity. Under immense mental agony, as my existence is under perpetual peril, I will try summarizing the inexorable and harrowing details of the wild events which led Robert to his blasphemous demise, and would explain my own fear as to why I shudder at the very thought of those raindrops, as to why particularly the season of rain makes me nauseous and sick, as to why my hound barks uncontrollably outside, and as to why this is the last time I will be experiencing heaven's precipitating. Though by the vague description of his insanity, one might think diligently over the abhorrent prospect, and react accordingly, coming to a common avenue of the conclusion that Robert was a degenerate lunatic. But much to my reader's astonishment, Robert in no way was insane, but a gifted scientific prodigy. Those who knew Robert even scarcely attributed his declivity insanity to his scientific erudition. He had commendable success in his field of expertise, and few odd times baffled even the greatest of researchers and physicists, although during several nights of sleeplessness his neighbor complained of the shrill scream coming from his abode, to which Robert always replied bleakly, "Encountering the unknown can startle even the most gallant of men, but I am only a mere meek researcher." Having completed his technical studies quite early in his life, Robert was left with ample time to further delve into the illimitable abyss of scientific studies, unbeknownst to the implications and hazards. It was during one of these frozen winter evenings when Robert met me. Wearied by the scarce luxuriances of my edifice, I often found myself strolling betwixt unknown graves of uncanny luster. Often I would be alone in my nocturnal strolls, as for generations alone graveyards have been associated with a dismal feeling of sheer ghastliness and emptiness similar to my own dreary life. For reasons I failed to gather, people always seemed to repel me, as they repelled a bad odor, least for some dreadful times when they required my ominous presence for their selfish deeds. Later in my nauseous existence, warped by listlessness and gloom, my self-confidence dwindled furiously. I was pushed into an interminable loop of unwanted misogyny, probably my miserable fault. It was during these pitiful times when the usual isolation betwixt equally dank, sorrowful trees filled my dismal chamber with transient gratification, when the iridate refuge of broken concrete slabs, the swaying branches of sullen trees, and the pale winter moon shining over gigantic roofs of ungrateful inhabitants vied for my grim attention. save for the occasional flapping of lousy wings of curious birds and the satisfying sound of my clumsy steps. Its premise was always empty, bathed in serenity and deafening noiselessness. The peaceful atmosphere, drenched always in a definite quality of sheer tranquility, helped me in my amble trudges, for as soon as evening light faded into oblivion, there arrived unheralded the darkness which engulfed the surrounding along with its poetic counterpart, melancholia. I often found myself staring both ways up front, a worn-out cemetery crossroad, withered by the virtue of merciless time. As for eternities, it saw incessant rain, frozen winds, steps of various stature and heaviness. Regardless, the withered out never vied for my attention, at the end always choosing the one which was less walked on, less experienced, but strange was the dawn in which Robert presented himself before me, as for some peculiar reason I dare not recall. For somehow, in a state of dumb stupor, I chose the beaten-out allée where trees of heavy branches formed a grotesque canopy, where only little moonlight reached through the wildings onto the concrete surface. For every step I took, there the hoary concrete path reverberated back an echo of hideous, intense rattling my inner soul. A fear of ominous severity and unknown origin caressed my tremulous body as I walked into the unknown territory, hiding unknown arcanas. I shook the haunting feeling and walked forward with the hectic pace, and far down the allée, under an odious tree shade, laid a curious soul. "Robert's my name," spoke the solemn man, smiling through his teeth, grinning ear to ear. "All my years of wandering here aimlessly, I scarcely remember an epoch where I spotted a glimpse of another soul in these forgotten parts of city." He spoke with an uncanny zest, and confidence gleamed in his voice, and despite the solemnity in his eyes, he rose from his hunched down position to meet me. "Edward," I said, as we both shook our hands. Down vine-covered alleys betwixt ashen graves of deceased and past overgrown bushes, Robert led the way, speaking of queer subjects all along the lonesome path. He claimed of great scientific deals, and often spoke and explained in weird scientific terms, which my imbecile mind couldn't grasp. During that evening I learned sparsely as to why the gigantic, interminable sky appeared to be blue, or why the shining star hovered in the zenith changed its color at different times of the day. He also promised me to show his plethora of scientific equipments, a prospect on looking back I should have rejected, since after that period only horror and fear have remained on my subconscious, and has pushed me on the edge of delirium. However, that night I slept soundly and dreamt of vivid prospects. That night I went to sleep smiling, exultingly knowing I had someone who would willingly speak of immaterial things, and would not belittle me because of my dumb queries. I know not why my imagination ran rampant in my hippocampus that night and the following day, for I dreamt of flying languorously over frozen swamps, rocky terrain, and dense canopies of innumerable sky-kissing sequoia. In my mind I performed impossible deeds, and saw never-ending possibilities which what little of erudition I gained in the evening before. In my weird fantasies I explored weird machinery and queer chemical tubes of varied sizes and shapes, and saw myself as an assistant. Robert was also present in my wild dreams, and together we performed adventures of scientific backdrops with uncanny zest and sprawling levity. The subsequent morning I received a rather disheartening message from his valet regarding Robert himself, for he had went out of town to his quaint country cottage for some undisclosed deeds and sent instead his servant to inform me. Having been invited earlier to his abode, I asked curiously about his daily chores. Reluctant at first, but later the dumb valet obliged and went to tell strange stories regarding Robert's rather weird experiments. On several occasions, the dumb valet had to pick him from a state of utter delirium and panic, to which Robert always replied with a pinch of his imbecile humor, "It's because of the lack of salubrious edibles. It won't be much longer until I hire another valet," only ever explaining the true reason. On several other weird dusks, Robert would scream as if in some great terror or jeopardy. During these manic states, Robert had to be sedated forcefully, and upon waking up, Robert never uttered a single bit of details as to what made him scream his feeble lungs out. In clear hindsight, I should have cut every bit of earthly connection with Robert, and should have left his blasphemous connections, but such is the power of science. Even though vaguely encountered, even in my bleak childhood, still perplexed me in Robert's company, kept me closer to the perplexing world of astronomy and other bizarre, inexplicable studies. I shunned the weird tales told by his dumb valet with utter haughtiness. After some strident protest and a promise for a delicious meal, the dumb man still subtly denied my every entreat. It was only after bribing him a fortune the valet agreed to my ambitious request. Even for an ephemeral period, his workplace was for me to skim over. In no time, we reached a cold cul-de-sac. I entered his grim driveway, located on the end of a desolate cul-de-sac. Towering, looming spires welcomed me. Rows of ancient windows lined up on the facade. Worn-out paint, or rather dismal mixture of gray and blue, was starting to come off the walls. Crisp leaves crunched under my feet as I walked into his immense driveway. Trees of various shapes and grotesqueness, each at some point of decay and isolation, jeered at me fiendishly, but uncanny hypnotism pulled me ever so slightly, save for the distant chirping of unknown local birds. Scarcely ever I noticed even the remnants of another living organism. The door creaked loudly as if unopened for decades. For just Robert and his servant, the immense establishment was an exaggeration, I thought to myself. The windows acted as some sort of kaleidoscope, for it gave the sun's rays vivid, iridescent colors. Inexplicable, I said to myself. A cool breeze blew in the immense hallway. Ostentatious and rather antediluvian furniture stood glittering in the immense establishment. Oriental and antique decorations lined up the immense walls of the Cyclopsean structure. The sound of my curious steps resounded in the gigantic hall. To my left lay a rather squalid and pitch-black room, door ajar. Must be the kitchen, I thought to myself. By his shriveled appearance at first, Robert didn't seem much wealthy, but I was mistaken, for the glittering, gleaming decorations were the most impeccable pieces of silver my eyes had ever witnessed. My eyes still searched aimlessly for his workplace as I fantasized it in my dreams, for these luxuriances now scarcely vied for even the plainest of my attention. I quaintly asked the listless servant to guide me to Robert's workplace in the simplest of language. The old man motioned for me to follow him, an odd relief. The valet led me to a flight of peculiar-looking staircase. The walls were lined with queer scratch marks, definitely human. Evident was the drop in temperature. Uncannily, the servant seemed quite unaffected. Sinister thickness in the air engulfed us as we went downstairs. "Sir," he motioned me to go in, the same bleak expression covering the old man's face. To say I felt ecstatic would be a derogatory statement, and won't do justice to the paroxysms of exquisite happiness, for my mind, a mere destitute in the vast abyss of science. It still felt a weird perplexion to the several strange apparatus and dormant machinery. I skimmed languorously over each one of them, each of those comprehending little, yet still meaning a ton. A lone window in the far corner of the dusty basement provided only a little effulgence left, a strange-looking wooden armchair in definite obscurity. It was only tumbling over a strewn splinter the armchair collapsed into my reality. Weird, I thought to myself, as drenched and surrounded in the atmosphere of luster stood a bleak armchair. It was unlike any my eyes had ever seen, for a plethora of wires protruded in and out of the strange armchair. Headgear of some sort was carefully placed at the center. Following the web of wires at the end stood another immense machinery. Perplexing gauges and immense handles of indefinite lengths projected out of it. The area around the armchair and machine, as I noticed, was sinisterly darker than the rest of the basement, even though at the corner various papers, some half-written, some hastily scrawled upon, whilst having some inexplicable calculations laid unkempt on a dusty table. November 28th. For some strange reasons, betwixt all my efforts, past all my intelligence, diligence, and patience, it didn't work. Having been scrutinized multiple times, having my calculations redone, I still can't find the fallacy. Hypothetically, it should work. It should. I will revisit the cabin tomorrow. December 3rd. It finally worked. It worked a day before writing this journal. To perfectly relate an accountable reason, the machine had to pass another scrutiny. A weird coincidence gathers around the working, for the machine works only when it rains. Preternatural, I don't think. It must have to do with ions or something, or just the propagation of energy. I have to come to a reasonable conclusion. December 4th. My quest eases, but the experiment is still surrounded by a blanket of fog and disillusion. Temperature drops rapidly when the machine works, which rules out thermodynamic principles. A negligible amount of heat is emanating from the wires. Is resistance negligible? I think I'm going insane. Also, whilst working, today strange events happened. December 5. I'm now afraid to work in the basement alone. I might invite Alfred to the basement with me at night, but I fear he may trip or disturb the apparatus. Either way, it's becoming increasingly difficult to carry on my work as unexplained events surround the workplace. Cassius would have liked to see this. The machines work, but the temperature drops. It's insane. Whilst on my transient walks in the cemetery today, I met a mate. The first of mankind since the inception of this project. Kind soul. As the complexities in the journal proceeded beyond my intellectual limits, the journal found its place again on the dust-laden table. Having not accounted for the unbearable coldness, I left early. Content with my concealed adventure, I waited for Robert's return. Though something queer and inexplicable happened that night. Hideousness engulfed my dreams. Terror seized my nocturnal fantasies that night. To say the walkthrough of Robert's home might be the reason of my horrible nightmares might not be fully false, as in my dream I saw something like that of the sinister machine once again, with its mangled serpents like wires, slithering out of it towards me. In it I felt a weird sensation of some dark void, a slippery presence, and a sudden chill of immense grotesqueness. Then I woke up. I finally woke up. Rapid knocks on my door startled me. I walked from my drunken stupor, mind still grasping hold of the situation. Still hazy and incoherent, I nearly twisted my ankle. The knocks increased in audacity. Through the people I saw Robert, standing on the porch, smiling exultantly. Along with the cold wind arrived inside an uncanny zest, contrasting the dismal weather outside to gigantic proportions. Macy, my 100-pound dog, started barking furiously at Robert. Often she is drenched in a hospitable quality. I can't fathom the reason for this hostility, I said to Robert, who stood unflinched by the sudden change in emotion. I feel really ashamed after all these evenings of talks. I haven't yet invited you to my home, Roger said ecstatically, with a hint of usual benevolence and somnolence in his eloquent eyes. A soothed respite and redress for my gloomy lifestyle, I wonder, though the trip earlier flickered an unprecedented visual of despicable quality in my dreams. I still went, half reluctant. On the way to his abode, Robert spoke of curious, mind-dwindling prospects again. On my quest earlier to his home, I only caught a glimpse of the weird machinery, but a solution of hideous and perplexing was its queer usage. For Robert spoke of immense grotesqueness, for somehow he wanted to acquire inhuman attributes, similar to Macy's, a hound in general, he regarded with morbid lividity. The feeling of general abhorrence increased even further as he carried on with his blasphemous speech. We reached the cul-de-sac again. The immense structure stood leering down at me. The trees appeared to as if they sensed something unpleasant too. His servant, the old man, stood at the portico. "Is it ready?" Robert asked the old man. "Yes, sir," the valet replied bleakly. Down unlit, claustrophobic clusters of crimson steps, we reached the door. The general feeling of unknown and dread increased in intensity, even more as I reached the end of those horrid steps, each creaking despicably one by one. "Here it is," Robert exclaimed, pointing at the weird armchair with supreme haughtiness. Unbeknownst to him that I had already meddled with his invention, a lone candle provided just enough effulgence to carry on with the daunting procedure. "Why can't we light artificial electric bulbs?" I asked Robert out of inexplicable fear. "It may interfere with the experiment. I know not the exact reason, for it only tends to proceed in the lack of light," Robert exclaimed calmly. "Help me out here. You're just standing, mate," said Robert. I proceeded, helping in the ordeals. The luminescence was vain as the wick flickered violently. As we spent more and more time in the basement, it seemed as if the darkness grew ever malignant, sinking out other corners of the dark basement too. The sense of unevenness passed, but a deep, morbid feeling of unpleasantness stayed still in my weak body. "It's just a matter of time now," said Robert, with the same benevolence in his tone. A kind soul, I wondered. Through history, Homo sapiens have been known for their gut instinct, the inexplicable feeling of unknown and bane. For more than a significant time, those deep residing fears, those perpetual ululations of the subconscious, have turned out to be true. Those primal fears, fear of being mauled, a grisly death carried on for centuries, until people started disregarding it with hideous levity. It was this fear of being shunned and laughed upon, stunted by myself to express the harrowing feelings. I obliged to the instructions, played the part of assistance with commendable loyalty. The room became darker with each passing second, and each passing second seemed dreadful eons. Then it began, the flickering, the shriveling wick. Darkness. The soft, ambient disappeared, leaving us in darkness. Flapping of curtains, pitter-patter of raindrops, the confused expression on Robert's face, the weird machinery's weird sound, a lightning flash of enormous luminosity and blood-curdling intensity, and then silence, hush, disturbed by the most insane scream. Robert was screaming at the ceiling. "It shouldn't be! It can't be!" screamed Robert, words blending with the monstrous intensity in his screams, repeating those same sinister words. "Freeze! Don't touch, stranger," said the same valet, rushing down those crimson stairs. All the while, Robert kept screaming hysterically. Robert had to be sedated again. Only this time, I knew the reason. Day to noon, I sat there glancing at those curtains, at the ceiling, at Robert. All the while, rain kept pouring outside. Those trees outside. Every time I passed by his window, those trees portrayed a hideous caricature, while darkness leaped from damp corners of his exquisite abode. Suddenly Robert sat upright, his eyes now staring directly at those corners, his pupils dilated beyond comprehension, preternatural. There lays an unseen world beyond our wildest extents of imagination, and is yet to be explored, similar to the fantastic interstellar space. The human brain can only comprehend a sheer amount of superficial data, but what lies beyond humans' farthest comprehension is the horrific spectral dimension, realm plagued with various otherworldly beings of hideous grotesqueness, some decent, some wicked, Robert exclaimed as if a morbid fact. "A shadow lurks over here," said Robert. "I don't know why. It is they appear only ere the experiment. I know not why they appear at all, and I dare not fathom their origin. Being a man of science, I am forced to obliterate the reasoning of a paranormal prospect." "This is beyond science," I exclaimed further. A gentle breeze blew through the window. The candlelight started to flicker violently, just like those shadows. I started feeling uneasy again. Robert spoke again. He sat there unblinking and unmoving, gazing into infinity. I fondled for the light switch to get a respite from the uneasiness, and in the process, tumbled down his humongous pile of work papers. I could not find those darn switches. Stay still, for as light is for us, darkness is for them, he spoke calmly. Uncannily, fast drift blew through the open window panes, the strewn papers flew across the floor, and what I saw next made me follow Robert's advice at once. The terrifying sight eradicated several dumb and imbecile inquiries. Leering down upon us from the ceiling was a black mass, paper thin, resembling closely a shadow. I looked at Robert. His face, now drenched in definite fear, was gazing straight upward too. An expression of pure, indescribable terror surmounted his face. The electricity returned at that instant. The blinding luminescence came as a deliverance. They are now ubiquitous, Robert spoke, queer calmness in his tone, despite the severe cataclysms. What are they? I questioned, still perplexed and equally petrified. I shall write a letter to you, as I am dubious as to the extent of their hearing capacities. He spoke with the same uncanny, stolid tone. You must leave now. On the way home, no westward wind or a certain brother-like figure accompanied me, only the silence of the city, distant bustling of neighborhood kids, snow gently caressing my skin, and an inexplicable tone which I always hummed to myself. Shades of blue, violet, and black pushed their way through the grays and whites. Blue for hopelessness, I wondered, then violet for despair, I asked myself. Society grimaced at me for aeons. Expecting some scarce and acceptance grew manifold. It seemed a long way back home. Macy now always looked through me. A puzzled look dominated her face, always glancing and peering behind me, whether it was the pensive weather outside or the time spent contemplating on that obscure experiment I know scarcely of. My mind soon plunged into the unfathomable recesses of sleep. Sojourning in the safe clutches of sleep was a transient phase, the only phase where my mind witnessed gratification before the hell which was about to loose, the blasphemy which leered at me from beyond, the abnormality way beyond my cerebral capacity. It was betwixt this confinement when I so plainly experienced the preternatural events Robert witnessed. I woke up. Macy's muddy footprints were all over the house. It was raining cats and dogs. What on earth is she doing outside? I wondered. Macy? I called out for her, while still in my antediluvian bed. I walked towards my corridor. Bitter dryness in my throat urged me to grab a jar of water. As I walked out of my room towards the corridor, the darkness seemed to move as well, inexplicably. Then what happened next, if read carefully, will justify the course of actions I took. A sane person, a man indeed, will never consider leaving their best friend at the hands of something unidentifiable, something unexplainable, yet at that moment of pandemonium and disarray, I considered, for once I considered a harrowing decision, of leaving Macy in that doomed corridor, though I'm glad I chose otherwise. Beyond the corridor, as I was making my way through it, I spotted out a candle, since electricity in those parts of England was a luxury, and during storms it was rare occasion to witness it. So I believed I lit some point before sleeping. Then something happened. The lambent, fluctuating glow disappeared. A shrill shriek of terror emanated from beyond. Stare out of hideousness looked back at me from the dark corridor. A puzzled, inhuman scream, a blow of horrible intensity. Maisie running out of the corridor, leaving those same muddied footprints all over. It happened furiously. I ran after her. I ran for my life. I ran from that sinister shadow, from those eyes. I ran to that cul-de-sac again, Maisie following behind closely. I had to get answers, a respite. All the while, the Bane sky took hideous colors. The clouds imitated those twisty, shadowy things. Madness engulfed the cosmos, constellations, an ungrateful epoch, and the wicked sky. As I inched closer to his abode, visibility lowered even more, for the trees around his home looked even more colossal. Mary was reluctant to come inside, but soon followed after me. Tranquility omnipresent, stench of death ubiquitous, dread ever-present. "Robert?" I called out his name, only to hear my tremulous voice back. "Robert?" I yelled out again, only to receive my trepidating voice, shaky as ever. "Where are you?" Patience insidiously slithering out, leaving behind a shaken man. I hastily searched his abode for remnants, clues, anything. Then I decided to walk down those crimson steps. Maisie still behind. At last I stood again in the unwholesome basement. The light was scarce now, and I disappeared altogether at the end of the basement. Bits of paper were scattered all over. I picked his journal and opened the last bits of it, scarcely decipherable now. December 27th. The day started well, for the trees outside swayed in unison, emanating crests and troughs, draped in serene tranquility. The corner of the damp basement was bathed in the same sinister darkness, but I didn't let anything deter me. Gallantry paid off, as my genes shew signs of mutations. Radiations and a safe dosage paved its way. I shall trudge forward safely. What radiation? What mutation and what DNA? I did not speculate. For the sun was already setting, the clouds, those abhorrent miracles of nature. The unceasing calamity was already spreading its dark tendrils over the fiendish sky. It was about to rain. The darkness would engulf everything. Even those trees refused to swerve in the cold breeze, standing utter still as if in retaliation. Cyclopsian renegades, as if against the hideous experiment. December 28th. 29th, 1, 3. I hastily searched for a clue among the several unkempt journals. Just a morbid hint, a petty cue or a meager indication of the whereabouts of the madman. Like a garish luminescence at the end of a claustrophobic cave, I have found something of sheer significance. December 13th. For the experiment to work, I need to have a systematic approach. Ameliorate my working conditions, for my mind is on the brink of lunacy, and the experiment is efficacious. Henceforth I shall seek the unceasing refuge of my cabin tomorrow, a remedy and surcease for a rigged brain. The cabin! Memories of which were sparsely stored in an obscure part of my brain. It must be the cabin, I thought to myself. I raced over to the part of town which harbored those woods. The torrential rain hindered my already haggard pace. At the end I reached that sinister place. I wish I hadn't met Robert, for that part of memory is hard to suppress. colossal dosage of morphine at times does the act. At least I clinch at the steel beams, often hurting myself, which at least keeps my madness from the outer world. Inside the cabin I saw horror, pure blasphemy, similar to the basement. Everything was dark, wires with various outlets mangled into each other, blood lined up on the walls. Macy was now barking furiously at something. As I moved further in, the stench overwhelmed me. Bitter coldness in the air, or just my wet, soaking clothes. I don't know what made my body shiver violently. "Robert!" I made one last feeble attempt at calling out his name. No answer. All of a sudden, something at the far end of the cabin made a screeching sound, as if some creaky wooden door. Macy was now growling hysterically at the now ajar door. Treacherous sight awaited me at the far end of the impious cabin. I covered my eyes in horror as I saw the actions of a wretched spirit, agitated with whatever Robert did to it. Inside, draped in an outrageous amount of blood, was the swollen, bloated corpse of my dear friend, gazing into oblivion, as if in the obscurity of his demise. The rain outside increased in audacity, even further tormenting my soul to an infinite amount. The thought of those dreadful raindrops touching my bare skin has caused me innumerable problems. My windows remain forever closed now, blinds shut for eternity. The raindrops, like miniature bullets, continued hitting the weak gable of that horrid cabin, but the peculiarities which still haunt me today, which still aggravate my blood pressure to abnormal levels, which still force me to take those detestable pills, were his limbs, either sewn, mutated, or developed, or just a morbid, obscene miracle. Somehow, instead of normal humanoid legs I was accustomed to seeing on a human structure, were instead the paws of a bloody hound. Robert somehow finally managed to acquire the attributes of a hound, but at a cost of going against nature. It all falls into perspective now. A sacrilegious void of ghastly nature, with the purpose of stopping Robert from achieving his hideous goal. But now the shadow is after me, as I know too much about it. Knowledge always comes at a price. As I stood in the cabin in disbelief and fear, the weak gable tore open in a frenzy and released unimaginable amounts of flood and terror. The dead remains of Robert still lay there unflinching, and as I stood there still dumbfounded, the pair, those sick pair of those hideous legs, twitched, convulsed rapidly. The last straw which set my mind on a perennial state of lunacy and insanity, I suppose, visions of which are ever redolent in those dark, voidal clouds, reminiscent of which still puts my dreary mind on a fit of migraine. Upon seeing the terrifying sight in a dream, I raced out of that portentous cabin, and ever since following me incessantly in a nightmare shadow. In my ear rings its unceasingly screams, which drive my mental health to shambles. I can still hear its shrill screams as I write this. The deep growls of Macy reached an ear-piercing crescendo before fading into a low, pitiful yelp. It devoured her. Oh, Lord, have mercy upon her. It's lurking closely somewhere. The shadows are now hovering directly over my dilapidated house. It's raining. Oh, God, coming. The shadow. It's here. So quoth this raven. A huge thank you to the Nightinator for posting this on my subreddit, Madam Raven's Darlings, for the purpose of sharing it with you guys. I hope you enjoyed it. He has such a wonderful Lovecraftian flair. Thank you for all coming to my chateau to hear me out. It means so much to me when you show up. And special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Ermin, Darren and Jennifer, Laura, Mutant Artificial Intelligence, Tabby Cat, and of course, Charlotte Emerson and Cortez Williams.